We're here at the Nanaimo River estuary on eastern Vancouver Island. It's a good sized city, and apparently all of these oysters that you see all around me are contaminated from the city being right to my right. So we can't eat them as humans, you'll get sick. But for a Sasquatch, and we've heard numerous reports lately from the last decade of Sasquatches being heard and seen on the Indian Reserve at the head of the estuary here. And what are they coming down here for? Well, right here you can see it. There's just hundreds of pounds of oysters. They just simply have to pick them up, the ones that are full, get an armload, get in the bush, smash them together, or use a rock, and inside is the oyster meat. And it wouldn't take a Sasquatch more than probably 45 minutes to a little over an hour, and they'd fill their belly with oyster meat that would keep them going for 24 hours or so. But about a year and a half ago, my son and I came here on a really big low tide in, I think it was the end of May. And right behind me here, it was all dried up. And we saw a couple native people walking, and one of them had a rake, and he'd bend down and he'd pick up a crab, a Dungeness crab, and he'd throw it off to the side because it was too small. So my son and I went over to see him, and he showed my son how to look for little divots in the sand at low tide. And that's a Dungeness crab that has crawled into the sediment, the sand, to wait for the tide to come back in. And my son started going around putting his hands down, and within an hour he'd found over 80 Dungeness crab. Most of them were undersized and too small. But for a Sasquatch, there is no size limit for them. They're going to eat male or female, whatever they find. And the females that my son found were filled with eggs underneath the plate on the bottom of their shell. Just wanted to show you, if a Sasquatch come down here at night, and if you grabbed a rock like this, he could come to it and just bang these little things here, and they're called China hats, and there's meat exposed by hitting them. And right here you pluck off, and there's a mussel right there. Small, he wouldn't waste his time with that, but some of these mussels around here are that big, and on the open waters the mussels are over a foot long with a lot of meat inside. But here in the Nanaimo estuary, where we hear Sasquatch reports, and you hear people talking about anchored out in bays, and at dark of night at low tide they'll hear click, 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 and they wonder what that noise is. And I've even had people say, is that bears? And I'm like, no, it's Sasquatches. They come down and like that, and look at that meat. Eats it like that, goes to another one, bangs it, and inside exposes all of that meat. So these are small oysters, but some of them around here are about 8 inches long, about that big. So you can see it doesn't take them very much to get their food. Right there, open it up, and there you go, all the oyster meat inside. There you go. Not much, but you know, it all adds up. Scrape that out with your fingernail, you got a little bit of meat. So that's what the noises are when people are anchored out, that clicking. That's them smashing the China hats, which you see small ones here, mussels and oysters that are attached to rocks. Because in some places in British Columbia, I've noticed that the boulder beaches like this one, the oysters are all stuck to the big boulders. Unlike the sand behind me, there's oysters spread out, just acres of it. But that gives you an idea of Sasquatches and how they eat here in coastal British Columbia, Washington State, and even southeast Alaska. Okay, walk this rock right here. Okay. So, Sasquatch coming down, when I was talking about boulders, all kinds of oysters, all kinds of food, but what the bears do and Sasquatches is roll these over. And there you go. Look at all the crabs. That's a mouthful of protein right there for a Sasquatch. So you can see the boulders around here, that underneath them, when the tide goes down, hundreds, thousands of little crabs that Sasquatches can eat. My decades out in the bush I used to have 22 rifles, and I'm deadly with them, you know, up to about 40 to 60 yards. But behind me, you see those two seagulls. So if I had a 22 right now, I could turn around and shoot one and walk out in probably 6 inches of water and grab my food. A seagull will probably feed me for 2 or 3 days. But you have to equate that to Sasquatches. We know through the reports that they're deadly with rocks. They can throw rocks like laser beams and get their targets. And I haven't heard any Sasquatch investigators factor in, when they go investigating, all the birds they hear. The little dicky birds, the wild turkeys, the doves, crows, you name it, birds. But we have reports in the Pacific Northwest of Sasquatch using sticks, rocks, and hitting their targets. Ducks, seagulls, eagles, even blue herons like the big one we see here out there feeding on little fish. So once again, low tide, highest concentration of protein on Earth. Behind me, birds, another food source for Sasquatch. The protein, the nutrition that they can gather here at low tide at night, you know, nighttime after midnight, there's no humans out here. And just up the estuary there's oysters and crabs at low tide. If you dig around, you'll probably even find cockles or clams. Even though it's right here in a city, there's Sasquatch reports. And that's what I've been telling people and educating them on, is don't go into the yarn basket, into the steel wool of North America, the forest. Come out to these beaches with your FLIRs, your video cameras, your night vision, your parabolic listening devices, and I guarantee you, you're going to have a greater chance of coming across a Sasquatch and filming it or recording the audio when you come to the exposed beaches at low tide, because as you can see, there's nothing but food for them. And as scientists have found in Pacific Northwest, in areas where there's high tide flow, and at low tide, an exposed beach like this, it's the highest concentration of protein on Earth per cubic yard or cubic meter. On the surface, you'll have oysters in some areas, and you have boulders that you roll over. There's baby crabs and rock crabs, eels, bullheads, a type of fish that can be the size of your pinky or even up to that big. And some of the crabs, like here, you can get ones that are legal size, 6.5 inches across the top of the shell. So that if you have a sports fishing license or a native food fishing license and it's a male over 6.5 inches from tine to tine, you can take that home and eat it. And in areas that are away from the cities and the outflow of the sewage systems, those shellfish are not contaminated. So Pacific Northwest, coastal region, if you want to increase your odds of finding a Sasquatch, this is where you want to be. Not out there in the mountains that are full of trees and bushes and hills. Only Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were able to document on video a very good Sasquatch for a few seconds. Patty, as we all know. Very few others have come out of the cabbage patch and given us good film of a Sasquatch. With Stephen Majors and Adam Davies 3 years ago, Peggy and I, sitting on a yacht, having some beverages at 10:30 at night. Adam goes out for a cigarette with a FLIR, knocks on the door and opens it and says, "Tom, you better come out here." And when I looked through the FLIR, there was a large bipedal something walking around at half tide rising. So to better your chances of finding Sasquatch, come to the beaches, go to the lake shores, go to the rivers with open banks and everything, or to the edge of the cornfields and orchards. Stay out of the cabbage. Come to the beach.